in the, please go ahead and put your name on that just so we know you attended both 101 and 201. For anybody on the phone, there will be some contact information on one of the last slides for you to send an email over to Mr. Colton Richardson and myself, just so that way you can get credit for the training certificates. Throughout the presentation, feel free to ask questions. We really don't mind. We are hoping to get through this presentation with about 25 minutes to spare, so we will have some time for questions. We will be uploading to the SharePoint the updated presentation slides, as well as some PM, RPM cheat sheets, the FAQs with some commonly asked questions, and some completeness talking points, etc., and then sending that link out to everybody. If you're a PM or an RPM, we recommend you print out those cheat sheets and keep them in your cubes for quick reference. If anyone is having issues with Zoom, try Internet Explorer, and if that doesn't work for you, then please follow along with the PDFs that were attached on the invite. The page numbers or the slide numbers on the PDF attached on the invite might be slightly different than the ones we have here, so please follow along with the slide titles, and we will try calling those out as we move along. For Audit 201, this is going to be a deeper dive, more detailed information than what we had in the 101 overview. We are going to have 7 modules today, going over the introduction to 201, going over the audit process review, decoding some of that auditor language that a lot of people probably don't understand the terms and definitions. We'll get through those. Talking about management assertions. The big thing about management assertions is that's what the auditor is going to grade us on. And we'll talk about the 5 main management assertions that the auditor is going to be looking for. In Module 5, we'll be talking about internal controls and controls testing and what that means for you. What the various audit opinions are. Again, the DoD's goal is to get a clean opinion, reviewing NFRs and findings, and wrapping up and recap. Moving on to Introduction to Audit 201. So just a review on 201 and 101's purpose. We want to provide every FIR stakeholder, it's everybody in this room and everybody on the phone, a deeper understanding of what internal controls are, what the controls testing will be from the auditor and how those apply to you, what the management assertions are in an audit and what the auditor is going to use to grade us, what the various audit opinions are, the audit findings, and just keep in mind there's 24 federal agencies. You're only one of 2 that have not gotten a clean audit yet, so Congress is definitely focusing on us for that, and what your specific roles and responsibilities are. Commitment to the FIR program is absolutely critical, so we really appreciate everybody's attendance. We know that these are busy times, and this is a lot of time to devote to FIR training, so we do appreciate that. Mrs. Reyes is going to be talking about Module 2.
Good afternoon, everybody. Glad to see everybody's back. Oh, it looks like we got a couple of extra people. Who wasn't here this morning? Oh, nice. Well, glad you all could join us this afternoon. Okay. I'm sorry? Oh, yesterday morning. Oh, okay, gotcha. So is there anybody who is here for the first time? No? Okay, everybody's good then. Okay, we are going to go over the audit process, starting with the financial statement audits and what that is, slide 8. So has anybody actually participated in an audit previously? Show of hands?
Well, I'm not sure if ours was an actual real audit, but when I first got on 2017, they did the Joint Base San Antonio.
Oh, okay. So was it an Air Force internal audit or a FIR audit? Probably not a FIR audit, but.
It was a regular audit firm that came, but it seemed like it was more of a, I don't know if you call it practice, but anyway, like I said, it was when I first got on, so
Okay.
I was busy finding a lot of stuff.
Okay, and how about you, Gerald?
Air Force Audit Agency.
Okay. So nobody here has been participated in the FIR audit yet? No? Okay.
Actually, they did one in Vandenberg
Uh-huh.
a few years back, but it was kind of a small first checkup of how they're gonna do it.
Okay.
The auditors were there, and Deloitte was there too.
Oh, Deloitte, okay, great, so you have some minor interaction with them. So, just to let you all know, yesterday, somebody brought up a question, because it's good for us to get feedback from you, so that way we can improve processes and make sure, we take that information back to PRD, back to, CVRA as a whole and restoration as a whole. But, yesterday, one of the PMs told me that, when he was interacting with the auditor, they were asking him about the general accounting principles. And so I found that kind of shocking. So because he provided that information to me, we were able to determine that we should go ahead and add that type of question to the frequently asked questions list and then provide an appropriate response. That way, if that issue ever comes up again, you all have what you need and you know how to respond to a question like that. So the type of interaction that we have with you all is really important. That way we can improve our processes. But the purpose of the financial statement audit is to report any deficiencies in regard to our internal controls. And again, our internal controls is that system of checks and balances that we have in place to make sure that we have a reliable and accurate financial statement. And we also want to make sure that we're in accordance with the laws and regulations, specifically the generally accepted accounting principles, as I mentioned. Luckily, after I was told that yesterday by the PM, we realized we mentioned GAAP several times in 101 and 201, so you all should at least be familiar with the acronym. So hopefully that's helpful to you all. So the auditor also will provide an opinion in regard to the effectiveness of our internal controls, and we'll go over audit opinions and the types of audit opinions more in Module 6. And we also, the auditor wants to assure the decision makers that the financial statements are reliable. It's hard for Congress to make, good, reliable decisions if the information that we're giving them isn't accurate. Going on to the audit process life cycle, slide 9. So the financial audit manual is the approach to the financial statement audits, and it involves 5 phases that we're going to discuss here. Phase 1 is the planning process for the auditor. So currently they're in that planning phase. We had the kickoff meeting on Monday. We discussed everything, key highlights from fiscal year 19, lessons learned. They gave us some information on what to expect for fiscal year 20. And they also have already requested our process cycle memo and the PRD guide. So they're looking over all of that in the planning phase. The internal control phase is phase 2, and that's when they'll actually go through, review the PCM and the PRD, make sure that, try and get related to all of our processes, make sure that the internal controls are effective, and make sure that we're in compliance with all of the laws and regulations. Phase 3 is the testing. That's when they actually take a look and review those key supporting documents, make sure we do what we say we are doing and following our processes, and at that time they can also evaluate a transaction from, say, its inception all the way to the financial report itself. And then phase 4 is the reporting. The report comes out from the auditor every November, and we'll go over what the fiscal year 19 report stated later on in the training. And then the auditor will also offer an opinion, and we'll discuss the opinion that was provided for fiscal year 19 later in the training as well. And then the last step is post-audit remediation and sustainment. They track the NFRs and how we are meeting our milestones for the corrective action plan. So let's discuss the flow of information or requests for fiscal year 19. That is slide 10. So the auditor, which is Ernst & Young, EY, sends a request to staff via the audit response tool, and then that gets forwarded to the FIR team in the audit response tool. The audit response team forwarded the request to PRD and the data group. I think we went over this morning, the fact that last year's audit was very PRD data group centric. And then the response is provided via DoD Safe or email, depending on the size of the documents in the response. We upload that information to Share Drive and then submit the response to the auditor via the ARC tool. Yes, sir.
One question.
Uh-huh.
Fifth bullet, PM, RPM, to PRD data group via DoD. Are you saying, you're actually saying the PRD is gonna do it via SMO, right? Or are you saying I, as a PM, are gonna send the data group via SafeMail?
So what happened last year is we really didn't have any involvement with the PM or RPM. The PRD group and the data group were pretty much able to gather everything via like the audit files, so we didn't really have to engage the PM or the RPM much.
Yeah,
There was only one instance.
The data group by DoD Safe?
Uh-huh. So if the response that you have is a large file, and you're not able to just email it over, and you may not have access to the share drive, then in that case, we would use DoD Safe, right,
As needed.
right, as needed.
How do you repeat that for the folks on the phone?
So the question was, if a PM or RPM, provides a response, if they use DoD Safe, and the answer is yes, they do, but it depends. If you're able to provide the response, say in writing via an email, then that's sufficient. If you're able to, if you have access to our share drive folder for that particular audit request, and you can just drop it in the folder, that would work. But if you're not able to do either of those, then you may be required to use DoD Safe because the file is too large to send via email. So the flow of information, a request for fiscal year 20. It's basically the same process, except this time it may not be PRD and data group centric. It may involve anybody that's considered to be a FIR stakeholder. I have an example of that this morning. We received a heads up yesterday that we have 2 audit requests regarding Dover, and so I actually forwarded those over to the ISS, the branch chief, because it did involve some contribution from the PM and the RPM. So, but other than that, it's the exact same process. And we work out the details via the email, whether you can respond via email, whether you can drop it in a share drive folder. We'll give you the link to the particular share drive folder, or we'll tell you to provide the information via DoD Safe. So all that information is provided in the email when we send you the response or the request. So roles and responsibilities, I can't stress enough how important of a role the FIR stakeholders play in the FIR process, because without you all, there's no way we would be able to get all of this done. Y'all are involved in site identification and validation, the PRD process, site closeout. All of those processes affect the costs that are reported on the environmental liabilities line on the financial statement. So I think previously there was kind of a disconnection. Well, fire audits don't really apply to me. I don't really need to pay attention to this part. And now this is going to be the year where you're actually going to see how it applies to you, because if your installation is pinged for a site visit or any sort of telecon and interaction, now is when you're going to want to pull out your do's and don'ts and this training and make sure you're prepared. But if at any time you determine you have questions, all you have to do is reach out to us, and we'll make sure that you're up to speed. And, of course, you'll get a heads up if you are going to be involved in an audit visit or a telecon. So lastly, in order to have audit success, we have to have strong teamwork and coordination, and we need to be able to provide transparency to the auditor. And I'm going to pass it over to Adam for Module 3.
So for Module 3, I want to give some definitions and examples of some of the auditor language. I know that because y'all don't deal with auditing from day to day, a lot of these terms might go over your head. So I'm sure we've all heard words like internal control or audit tests or audit opinions. We're going to go through all that here. So under auditor language, slide 15, First is reliable. I think for the most part, everyone kind of understands what reliable means in a general sense, but specifically for auditing, the auditor wants to make sure that our financial statements are reliable. What they mean by that is they want to make sure that people who are using those financial statements to make decisions can rely on that financial statement to be accurate, so that way they are making sound judgments. The next word here is material. The easiest way to explain material in the auditing world is to just replace that word with the word significant. They just want to know if an issue is significant enough. If our financial statement is off by $1 and it's not perfect, the auditor doesn't really care all that much. They just want to make sure that our financial statements are free from adverse effects. Now, while we strive for perfection, we want our financial statements to be perfect, it doesn't necessarily mean that if there's a small error in there that we can't get a clean audit. So what they're mostly looking for is material issues, material deficiencies in our processes or our internal controls, and adverse effects overall. And the other thing is they want to make sure that issues aren't going to materialize into something bigger than what they are. So as I said in 101, if we have one transaction that's off by $1, but that transaction is occurring 1 million times, then we have $1 million problem, and that would materialize into something worse than just a $1 problem. Next are deficiencies. These are mostly talked about when it comes to gaps or weaknesses in our processes or internal controls. We spend a lot of time working on internal controls, as well as the PRD team, on improving our processes to make sure that we're complying with laws and regulations, to make sure that we are reducing risks and improving those processes overall to prevent mistakes from occurring. Internal controls, these are a system of checks and balances that are put in place to help achieve reliable financial statements. For example, your CAC card is there to safeguard assets to prevent people from unauthorized use. A supervisor's signature on a form could help increase oversight. We use many kinds of internal controls. A checklist, for example, if there's a 10-step process, we might put together a checklist to ensure that those processes are being complied with. And there might be a situation where someone needs to sign off on each process to ensure that people actually comply with those processes. And opinion. So opinion is essentially our grade that we get from the auditor, except we're not graded out of 100 or out of a 4.0. They're based on opinions, and there's 4 main types of opinions, and we'll get into those a little bit later. Moving on to basic audit terms. The first is audit risk. Right here is why is it extremely important to be honest with the auditor. We don't want to increase the risk of getting an inaccurate audit opinion. If the auditor is going to tell us that our financial statements are clean, we want it to actually be accurate and true. We don't want to get a clean opinion based on false information or because we lied to the auditor. So we want to do what we can to reduce the risk of getting an inaccurate or an inappropriate opinion. The next is baseline. Auditors like to use this term a lot. The easiest way of explaining baseline is replace it with the word inventory, or the initial gathering inventory, I mean. So for example, let's say you're 6 or 7 years old and your mom or dad is measuring your height on the door frame. That first mark, that first measurement, that's the baseline that everything gets compared to. So year 2 and year 3 go by and they're saying, okay, well you grew 2 inches from the baseline. They're kind of doing the same thing here. We have an initial gathering point, an initial quantity of sites that was gathered. And next year, we're comparing our sites to that. So, for example, we might say that this year we added 10 sites and we closed out 2. And so they're always tracking things against the baseline. So there were some initial baselining done back in the 1980s for some of the restoration sites. There was more baselining for different kinds of restoration sites that were done back in around 2010. And currently with PFOS and PFOA coming around, those PFOS and PFOA sites are currently being baselined right now. A word that's not up here that I want everyone to understand as well is the term universe. The term universe basically means is our inventory. What is our realistic inventory as it is now? The auditor likes to use the term universe when it comes to universe of sites, or our total inventory of sites, as well as transactions, so our universe of transactions, or the totality of transactions. Control risk. This is the risk that internal controls won't detect or prevent mistakes. These get rated between low risk, moderate risk, and high risk. How they determine these are trying to figure out if things are low impact or high impact. if things are low probability of occurrence or high probability of occurrence. We generally want to focus on high-risk things because we don't have enough time or resources to fix every problem. So we want to fix the high-risk internal controls first. That's things that are going to have the highest impact and the things that are most likely to occur a lot. Last here, as we've touched a little bit on in Audit 101, are generally accepted accounting principles, or GAAP. These are standardized practices across the entirety of the United States, both in the private sector and the public sector. So the auditor is going to be using these standardized practices to grade us. Moving on to basic auditing terms continued. Inherent risk. Inherent risk is the likelihood of arriving at an inaccurate audit conclusion based on the nature of the auditee's business. I know this seems kind of like a formal definition, so what does this mean? It essentially means that there's some natural risks that we can't necessarily diminish. For example, anytime there's an internal control or a process that requires human input, there's always going to be an inherent risk that someone might fat finger something or somebody might typo something, etc. We can't diminish that risk 100%. There's always going to be an inherent natural risk there. Next are management assertions. We'll go more into detail on what these are in the next module. But essentially, these are what the auditor is going to grade us on, the 5 metrics they're looking for, the 5 main things that they're always observing. And then materiality. This is the importance of something placed on a financial statement area, usually in the form of a dollar value. If we, as ENDL, are $13.5 billion and we have something on our financial statement that's only worth $100, that's not really something the auditor is going to focus on. They want to understand what is most significant on there. And last is sampling. Sampling is really going to affect a lot of people in PRD and the PMs, RPMs, and sometimes the ISS branch chiefs. Sampling is when the auditor is going to take a small sample to represent a larger amount of data, and they're going to request data from us to represent that larger amount of data. So if we have 1,000 documents in our inventory for something, they're going to ask for 20 of them, and they're going to look at certain things on those documents to be a representation of the thousands. So they're going to make sure that dates are correct, for example, that processes were followed, that they complied with laws and regulations, etc. Moving on to management 4, Mrs. Reyes is going to go a deep dive into management assertions.
As you can see, this training is pretty different from 101 because 101 was very general, very wide overview. This one is a lot more technical, and that's what we're about to dive into now, that technical aspect of management assertions. So management assertions, slide 19. So the purpose of the audit is to collect and evaluate evidence so that the auditor can provide an opinion on the reliability of our financial statement. So what is a management assertion? That's basically how the auditor evaluates us. There's 5 management assertions, which is basically 5 areas in which the auditor grades us. That's first one being completeness, existence and occurrence, valuation, rights and obligation, and presentation and disclosure. And we're going to go over all 5 of those in a lot of detail in the next slide. Starting with completeness, slide 20. So what is completeness? Now, this is one of those terms and one of those areas in which the auditors are going to dive into this audit season. So you definitely want to know what this is and how it relates to you. So completeness is the complete universe of a contaminated site that belongs to the Air Force. The auditor may refer to it as completeness. They may refer to it as the site inventory or maybe even the site universe. I've heard them use all 3 terms interchangeably, and what they're referring to is completeness. So why do the auditors care about completeness? Because if we have an incomplete inventory, then we have an understated cost to complete on the financial statement, and that's a big issue. So it's hard for the decision makers, as I said earlier, to make any decisions and do their jobs if we don't provide them with accurate information. And then, of course, the auditors are also concerned with the fact making sure that we're in compliance with all laws and regulations, specifically GAAP. So how do we illustrate completeness to the auditors? In the 80s and 90s, the Air Force went and did a fence-to-fence baseline survey of all of our contaminated sites. So that is the beginning of the collection of all of that information. It was a thorough study that was done. All the records are maintained in the administrative record. So we're really pushing the idea that you all need to be familiar with the installation, if you're working at an installation, with the installation administrative record. The auditor could ask you something like what's actually contained in the administrative record, or they could pull the documents themselves and then ask you specific questions about what's contained in the record. So if you're not familiar with your administrative record, that's okay. We have a guidance that we are going to provide to you all. It lets you know how to access that information. If at any time you determine you need assistance with this, just go ahead and send us an email, and we'll make sure that we work with you and get you up to speed. I know the auditors already mentioned for fiscal year 20, they're going to be working with Andrews Air Force Base, since that's where they're actually located, and they're going to be discussing completeness with them. But I don't know if at any time they're going to request another discussion with another installation. So you definitely want to be ready, just in case. Site inventory, the current inventory is maintained in ESOMIS, and the auditors are actually going to be taking a look at ESOMIS this fiscal year as well. The request won't actually come through restoration because it's a database, so it actually falls under the IT umbrella, so they're going to be pinging them and whoever's in charge of the actual ESOMIS database. But we do want to stay up to speed, and hopefully they'll provide us feedback on what they determine with restoration and what we have in ESOMIS. Key considerations for PMs and RPMs. You want to make sure that all of your SVRs are submitted and entered into ESOMIS. As Adam mentioned, PFOA is currently going through baseline, so you want to make sure that those environmental assessments are being conducted and you have the documentation for all of that, and make sure that the SVRs are being submitted for those PFOA sites. As we all heard this morning, everybody's under a lot of stress to get those ATRs in, but you have to make sure that you follow the processes. If I was an auditor coming in with my auditor hat, I would say, hey, PFOA is a new realm for them. How are they handling this? Are they following all the processes? You can't submit that ATR unless you have that validated SVR in place. So you want to make sure you don't deviate from any of our processes with those sites or any other site for that matter. Yes.
Okay, that's under the reference of documents, is that where it's going to be down?
Well, but are those being uploaded once they get final signature? Are they being uploaded by Laura after you get the final signature? Because when the PM's when it leaves the PM's hands, it doesn't have all the signatures.
Yeah, they're all in the.
Okay, so you'll upload them, PMs don't have to upload those?
Right.
Okay, just, okay.
Yeah, no, it's good to ask the questions because somebody else may have the same question because it is a new process. Okay, any other questions? And we always refer, if you have any questions in regard to PFOA sites, of course, you want to reach out to the PFOA team. Okay, existence and occurrence, slide 22. So what is existence and occurrence? ASCEC has to track every site in ESOMIS and confirm that an actual restoration cleanup site exists. So why do the auditors care about E&O? If a site's not in ESOMIS, then the CTC on the financial statement might be overstated. And of course, that's a big issue because we have to make sure that those are reliable and accurate. You'll hear us say that over and over for the rest of the day. We have to be in compliance with the laws, and we have to make sure that what is on that financial statement is reliable and accurate. Now, why should we care? We waste resources on planning and budgeting on invalid sites, and that actually happened in 2019. I don't think we actually wasted any resources other than time, but we had a site that I guess the site ID was changed by compliance, and then it came over to us. We knew the site was closed, but we inadvertently didn't realize that it was still included in the inventory. So once the error was realized, then that was addressed right away. But did I get all those details right, Laura? Yes. So we just want to make sure that nothing like that happens again, because errors like that do happen. And it wasn't, like I said, that we didn't realize that the site was closed. It's just we forgot to go to the inventory and make sure it wasn't on there. So if we don't follow the proper processes, we could get an NFR, we can have increased scrutiny. So we always want to make sure that we are following our processes. Existence and occurrence continued, slide 23. Key considerations for PMs and RPMs. Do the active sites in ESOMIS have the supporting documents to support the existence of the site? Are all the correct documents in the audit file? In ESOMIS, make sure all the active sites are in ESOMIS and part of either the PRD or the PAR process. And are the installation requirements validated via the PCAD, the balance sheets, and the BSISs? So here's like a visual for you in regard to completeness and existence. If all the sites aren't included in the site universe, then we have an understated CTC. If an active site exists, but it's not in ESOMIS, then we have an overstated CTC. And of course, the goal is to have an accurate cost to complete on the financial statement. I can't stress to you enough that all active sites, even closed sites, because are in ESO, they have to be in ESOMIS, and the closed sites will just be indicated as closed, correct? Yes. So MMRP sites, we just want to stress that those also have to be included in ESOMIS. I think we discovered, I believe last year, there were a couple of instances where they had documentation for them, but they weren't actually in ESOMIS, so that got addressed right away. Any other issues you might want to mention, Laura? No? Okay.
Is it possible to have a site in ESO that doesn't have an SBR on file? Do you have a way of running a database check on that?
Anything that was created prior to, say, 2012, when we took over the program, it wouldn't have an SBR.
Yeah, so it would be prior to the date that the SBR was created, right? Yeah. Okay. And that was created in 2012?
Around then?
So the question on the floor was, are there any instances in ESOMIS in which there isn't an SBR on file? And Laura, who's in charge of sites, indicated that there is, because the SBR was not created until 2012. So all of those older sites that are in ESOMIS that came in prior to 2012 won't have an SBR on file. Yes, please. Go right ahead.
Prior to the current process that we use now, air staff had ownership of the approving site.
Oh, okay.
So they had a form and they would fill it out, but it would go back to the base. So they may not have uploaded it to ESO.
Okay.
It may be somewhere out there that we don't have. So if people have it at the installation, it would be a good idea to go ahead and upload it to the reference tab so that we have it. But there was a process in place. And in 2012, that process was delegated to ER.
From who, did you say?
From air staff.
Okay, so apparently previously, prior to 2012, air staff was in charge of processing those sites. So they had their own form, but it's not believed that most of those forms are in ESOMIS. So if you're at the installation level and you come across one of those, please go ahead and forward it over to the PRD team, and not to PRD. Oh, just upload it to where? Oh, just upload it directly to ESO then, so we make sure that we have that on file if that ever comes up with the auditors.
Real quick, this is an excellent example of something that might come up during an audit, where an auditor would ask, why is there an SDR associated with this site that's looking at it? And that's a case where, we would coordinate with, somebody like Faye, who has a lot of institutional knowledge, and would say, this is a process that we didn't formally start until 2012. So we don't have an SDR for XYZ site at Dover Air Force Base because of this. And that is why, an auditor would, look at that and accept that as a validation.
But it wouldn't actually be a finding, right, because it wasn't part of our process prior to 2012 that the SDR be uploaded into ESOMIS?
Correct, and you guys, Adam, touched on it with the training. If you can explain something like that is, logical, and you have evidence of it, and you have evidence that the SDR is being used, has been used consistently, that will not be noted as a finding by the auditor.
Okay, good to know. See, this is why it's good for us to have interaction and discussion, because we learn a lot in these trainings. Okay, moving on to valuation, slide 25. What is valuation? It's an estimation of something's worth or something's value. So why do the auditors care about valuation? If we have an unjustified cost assumption, it leads to an incorrect CTC balance, and all costs have to be justified. The auditor confirms cost estimate assumptions are based on the laws and regulations, especially in regard to GAAP. So how do we illustrate valuation? ASCEC confirms our processes to develop cost estimates and make sure that they are consistent and of value. So key considerations for PMs and RPMs. Make sure that we have a complete audit file, and PRD is really exceptional at making sure we have all the documents that we need in place. If the auditor requests something that's in the audit file, PRD is really good at kind of glancing over all that information, making sure everything that needs to be there is there, and if not, I believe you all reach out to them, right, and let them know. Okay? Yeah, so they kind of do a really thorough pre-screening prior to it going to the auditor. So in the audit file, you want to make sure you have your cost itemization, your assumptions, evidence of management review and approval, training certificates such as RACER training and PRD trainings. And you also want to make sure the cost estimates are done in accordance with site cleanup requirements in the PCAD. The auditors confirm whether we're following our PRD processes and what we say we're doing in the process cycle memo as well. And if there's any changes made in the roll forward, you want to make sure those are applied to the cost to complete estimates as well. Can't afford to take any shortcuts. We always have to make sure we're following our processes to a T. Rights and obligations, slide 27. I know this is just overwhelmingly exciting. Management assertions is pretty technical and not the most exciting thing, but just bear with me. I think we have about 2 more. So rights and obligation, the Air Force must demonstrate that it has a right and an obligation to conduct remedial action on a cleanup site. So why do the auditors care about that?
Can I ask you a real quick
Yes.
question? The term remedial action, is that anything that is in the RI to RAO process, or is that only in the cleanup portion of the process?
Okay, that's kind of out of my understanding. Can anybody answer that question? What is the question again, sir?
Again, the words remedial action,
Uh-huh.
is that referring to anything that's in the circle process from investigation through the RAO phase?
Okay.
Or is that specifically, in the way that we look at it sometimes, of just the cleanup action or the closure action?
Okay. Anybody have any input on that? Yes, sir.
I think as I read it, whoever put that bullet together may not understand the nuance that a remedial action in our terminology is a very specific subset of the overall.
Okay.
So I think they meant the word generically as any of the activities that we undertake with their funds.
Okay, got it. And that'll actually probably be a good clarification for us to make. So again, Great for the feedback. Thank you for the input. And in regard to your question, I'll clarify, and we'll get back to you on it. So as far as what are rights and obligations, like I said, we have to make sure that we have a right and an obligation to do cleanup at a site. Why do the auditors care about that? If we have ineligible sites in the inventory, then we have the overstated cost to complete. So how do we illustrate to the auditor that we have rights and obligations? All sites in the site universe have to be DERP eligible and the sole responsibility of the Air Force to prove that we have a right and an obligation to clean up that particular site.
I think you answered his question.
Right.
And when it comes to legal, basically they say, if the site's DERP eligible, you can do something. If it's not DERP eligible, you can't.
You can't, right. Okay, so why should we care about rights and obligations? Again, we're wasting resources on ineligible sites. If that situation occurs, we can have inaccurate financial statements, we can have a finding, and of course, increased scrutiny as well. That's going to be the result of any type of instance in which we are not following our procedures. So PM and RPM procedures or considerations, make sure that you have that signed SBR as evidence of DERP eligibility and proof that the site is the obligation of the Air Force. If the site's closed, make sure you have all the proper documentation in place and make sure that it's reflected as closed in ESOMIS. If you see something that looks out of place or not correct, then definitely let Faye and Laura know immediately. Presentation and disclosure, slide 29, last one of the management assertions. So what is presentation and disclosure? We have to make sure that all costs are properly presented and disclosed in the financial statement, and the disclosure is actually the narrative the narrative portion of the Note 12, which details the explanation as to what Congress needs to know in that section. So why do the auditors care about P&D? Again, we have to make sure that what we're reporting is accurate and reliable, and we have to be in compliance with the laws. And that is the end of management assertions. So we'll go ahead and take a short break. What would be the return time, Adam? The return time is 1:50 p.m. Central Standard Time. And I'm going to put everybody on hold for a moment.
Almost. Moving on to Module 5 for internal controls and controls testing. Just to recap, internal controls are a system of checks and balances. They're put in place to reduce risk and achieve reliable financial reporting. They're also in place to safeguard assets and to ensure compliance with laws and regulations. Now, there's 4 main types of internal control designations. That's preventative or detective, and manual or automatic. If you type in a misspelled word into Microsoft Word, for example, and it changes that misspelled word for you, that would be an example of a preventative internal control because it's preventing you from making that mistake. It would also be an example of an automatic internal control because it's changing that for you automatically. If you misspell a word in Microsoft Word and it underlines it red for you, that's an example of a detective internal control where it's not changing it for you, it's letting you make that mistake, but it's alerting you that, hey, there's an error here. So lots of times in our IT systems, for example, you might get certain errors after inputting certain things that don't seem to make sense to the system. And that would also be a example of a manual control because you would have to manually change that to what it needs to be. There are 3 main internal control types. That's key controls, secondary controls, and compensating controls. We'll talk about that in a couple of slides. Next slide for internal control categories. Again, there's preventative, detective, manual, and automatic. Preventative is designed to prevent errors or fraud before it occurs, whereas detective is intended to uncover an error after it has already occurred. And then for manual controls, those are best used when judgment and discretion are required, whereas automatic controls are best used in environments with high volumes of similar transactions. So if you're in an IT system, for example, you input a number that doesn't seem to make sense, or you input a word where there should be a number, for example, it usually alerts you to that. For the three internal control types on the next slide, there are key controls, secondary controls, and compensating controls. Key controls are controls where there's the potential for financial statements to have a large impact if there is a failure in that control. And failure of that control could mean that the entire process could fail. And then you have secondary controls, which have the potential for financial statements to have an impact, but failure of that control might be deemed immaterial or insignificant. What's really important here for folks who are in PRD or for the PMs and RPMs that are involved in pre-table meetings and table meetings is when you look at your PRD guide, there will be certain steps in there that will be called C-1 or C-2, for example, or KC-1 or KC-2. Those are control steps that are put in place in those PRDs. So when you see something that says KC-1 or KC-2, those are key controls. And those are steps that you're really going to want to focus on because failure in that phase will mean failure of the entire process and can mean a very significant impact on the financial statement. So when you're in those table meetings, please make sure that you are following those steps correctly and to a T. And last but not least, we also have compensating controls. Now, when it comes to compensating controls, we are limited by time and money, so we unfortunately cannot prevent all mistakes from occurring. So sometimes we have to rely on compensating controls, where they are controls that are cheap enough or fast enough that can provide us a reasonable assurance that an error won't occur, but it might not prevent that mistake 100%. Moving on to the next slide for internal control components. The first is risk. Now, I think for the most part, everybody understands what a risk is, but specifically in the auditing world, what we're looking for is risks in internal control. Are things low impact? Are they high impact? Or do they have a low probability of occurrence or a high probability of occurrence? These typically get put into a 2x2 matrix where the probability of its occurrence is measured against its impact. So when you have something that's both high impact and high probability of occurrence, that's going to be gauged as a high risk, and those are the internal controls we focus on the most to fix. Again, we're limited by time and money, so we can't fix every single problem. We can't focus on improving every single control, so we try to focus on the high risk and moderate risk ones first. Next are risk assessments. AFCEC will conduct a risk assessment where they measure all of our internal controls. For example, if you look in the PRD guide and you look at those KC-1, KC-2, and C-1, C-2, they're looking at all of those internal controls and they're gauging all the risks of them and putting them together in a prioritization called the risk assessment. Next, there are control objectives and control activities. A control objective is a general goal that we want to achieve when it comes to controls. So, for example, we might have a control objective to reduce fraud or the occurrence of fraud. One thing we can do here as a control activity to account for that control objective of reducing fraud is put supervisor signatures on certain forms so that way no one person has their hand in a certain process, but now you have to have oversight and now someone else has to review what you're doing. The other control objective or the other control activities for trying to reduce fraud, for example, would be like segregation of duties. If there's a 10-step process, we don't want one person having their hand in every single one of those processes. Moving on to PMs and RPMs and internal controls. Again, we understand not everybody here is a PM and RPM, but y'all, we just want to make sure that y'all understand y'all's specific roles when it comes to internal controls. Why should you as a PM or RPM care about internal controls? Well, the auditor is going to test each one of these internal controls, and they're either going to apply a pass or fail rating. Now, if we do get a fail rating, it doesn't necessarily mean that we can't get a clean audit, but it's a weakness that might be deemed insignificant, and we're still going to want to fix it anyways. But if we do fail a control test, it's still going to be more work for you in general. This means that the auditor is going to come back asking more questions. That's more questions that you're going to have to answer. You're going to have to respond to more requests because now they're going to want to increase the amount of sampling they do. If they were only sampling 5% of our documents, now they might want to sample 8% or 10% of our documents now. And then, of course, y'all are going to have to assemble and prepare more documentation. Next slide for internal controls and testing. There's two main test categories that the auditor is going to look at. There's test of design and test of effectiveness. Essentially, what is on paper versus what is in reality. We could design our internal controls to be absolutely perfect to prevent all mistakes from occurring, but if people aren't actually doing the process, then it's not going to be effective enough to reduce errors or mistakes from happening on financial statements. So the auditor is going to look at both. They're going to look at our guides, for example, like a PRD guide, look at the controls, see where the gaps and weaknesses are, if there are any in them. And then they're also going to look at how we actually conduct our business processes to make sure that we are following those processes. Next slide, for purpose of testing. So why does an auditor perform these tests? One, they want to determine if the estimates include all relevant site phases, that the costs are valid and appropriate, and that they have valid costs to complete. So there's a couple of things to kind of digest here. The first is that the estimates include all relevant site phases. Why do they care about that? Well, the auditor is going to track a transaction from cradle to grave. They're going to track it from its origin all the way to when it ends up on a financial statement. They want to see how that transaction matures, how it changes, the hands that it passes from, and all of the processes and internal controls that are applied to that transaction. So by the time it gets to a financial statement, they will have the confidence that that number is the appropriate number. The next thing is they want to verify accuracy and consistency between the documented and the performed processes. Again, what the controls are designed as versus what we are doing. What's on paper versus what is reality. We want to be consistent between both. We also want to show consistency between PMs and table processes, for example. If we have 10 PMs who are doing the same process for 10 different projects that are similar, we want those to have similar processes as well. Otherwise, the auditor is going to see that as a weakness of saying that, hey, only 9 out of 10 of these PMs did this process, why didn't the 10th one do it as well? They also want to verify that approving officials were properly designated to perform those activities. So, for example, an internal control you'll see a lot is supervisor signatures on forms. If it requires a supervisor signature, they're going to verify that it really was a supervisor that signed that. In other words, was the approving official, were they properly designated to perform that activity? If you're getting a signature from someone who isn't a supervisor, it's something that the auditor is going to catch. Next, they also want to verify appropriateness of site closeout justification. If we're closing out sites, they want proper documentation and justification that those sites really should have been closed. This year, specifically, the auditor is really going to focus on our site inventory. If we're off by one project, either being one less or one more, they're going to see that as a big problem. If we have 100 sites being documented, it should be because there's 100 sites in reality that we're responsible for. And last but not least, there will be 2 types of testing that will be performed. That is the testing of controls and substantive testing. So next slide for types of testing, for testing controls. The purpose of control testing is to determine that the controls are reliable for financial reporting and to verify that the entity complied with laws and regulations. Now, why does the auditor care about us complying with laws and regulations? Because if we don't comply with those processes, we could be understating our values and our estimates if we're not accounting for all the costs of those laws and regulations. They also want to make sure that there is consistency between all of the programs and the processes that we are doing. The key impact here is that control tests will directly determine the amount of testing that is done.
Can I ask a quick question on the site closeout?
Yes, sir.
Say, or Laura, you can help me out on this, but is site closeout requirement going to be based on the dirt or based on Air Force guidance? There is a difference.
If we're following our policy, we're gonna look at, so it would be dirt, it would be Air Force guidance, and then it would be internal policy.
Do you know which one takes precedence, if it's DERP over Air Force guidance?
I think it would be an issue if it differs. We had inconsistency.
Gotcha. So the question in the room is would site closeout be dependent upon Air Force guidance or depending on DERP requirements? The answer in the room from the PRD team is, well, there will be an issue if the two are misaligned. So if you do see a situation where that comes up, please notify them.
I think that's covered with the site closeout form. I mean, there's boxes to check off, there's regulatory concurrence, and there's legal concurrence. And I think Laura, checks all that before she closes out the site, so that's basically covering all of that.
The reason I ask that is because my understanding, and I have the site like this, and I know others that do, is I have an open site with no future programming against the site. And that's really not supposed to exist, I don't believe.
If you have land use controls required.
Nothing, no land use controls, no program. It's the conflict between the AFI and DERP.
What's illegal about it?
I have brought it to the data group several times, and I'm not getting an answer, so.
Okay.
Yeah, that's definitely something that we need to address, so, we'll kind of get with you afterwards so we can make sure,
Okay.
get an answer for you.
So most of those issues should hopefully be addressed with the site closeout forms that PRD will review. But if you do find an uncommon issue where there might be an issue between DERP and Air Force guidance, please let them know. Thank you.
This would also fall under things not to volunteer to tell them how to.
Right.
I agree. So for everybody on the phone, this
That is DMC, we only want A.
exactly.
It's great that we're talking about it here. So I know that in a program this big, there are these unique situations that do come up like that. So it's good that we're talking about it.
Agree. For everybody on the phone, this is definitely a good example of things we don't want to bring up to the auditor and volunteer additional information. Thank you for that.
Dave, what does legal say about that? Because they'd be the ones that would answer that question, not the data group.
Legal's fine.
Fine with what?
I can't get it closed. Because, we'll go to offline.
Yeah,
I don't
let's
wanna use
discuss it offline.
But there is a reason.
All right, appreciate it though. Next slide for example of controls testing, slide 40. Let's just run through an example of what this would look like. So first, the AFCEC CZO RPM would prepare an appropriate SVR, and then that SVR would go to the AFCEC CZ director or to the division chief for approval. Next, that director or division chief would approve or disapprove of that SVR and send it to the AFCEC data group. The AFCEC data group then reviews those inputs and signatures, and then the data group will review the ESOMIS for site record, and then they will notify the RPM that the site was recorded in ESOMIS, and the RPM will verify the correct recording in ESOMIS. Now, there's a couple of themes here to kind of notice. One is this transaction is passing through multiple hands. We don't want one person to have their hand in every single process. The other theme you'll notice is there's a lot of steps where there is verification for the previous process, where people are verifying that the previous person did their job correctly. And the second thing you'll notice here is there's a lot of oversight, a lot of either division chief approvals or director approvals. There's a lot of supervisory signatures here. All of these things play into internal controls to prevent fraud and to prevent mistakes overall, whether they were intentional or non-intentional. We want steps for validation. We want to check that things were done correctly, and we want to make sure that there is oversight. At the end of the day, the result at the bottom for site identification control, there are three things that we want for controls. For each control, AFCEC needs to identify a control owner, the timing of when the control is performed, and any supporting documentation. Now, this is going to be on the quiz later, so hopefully you all remember that. There are those three things that AFCEC needs to identify for the auditor: the control owner, the timing when the control is performed, and supporting documentation. Here's why that's important. One, we want to know who the control owner is, so when there's a failure in something, we know where that weak link was, right? And we can go back and ask questions. Okay, if a certain person is responsible for a specific control, then they know they're responsible for it. We don't want a generalized process up in the air and no one knows who's actually responsible for it, and then the process doesn't end up getting done. Timing, we also want to make it clear when that control process is supposed to happen, and the supporting documentation so we can prove that a certain process or a certain control actually did occur. Moving on to the next slide for types of testing for substantive testing. The purpose of this testing is to determine whether the assertions are materially misstated. Again, those assertions are the things that the auditor is grading us on, those 5 main assertions. And they're trying to determine if whether or not they're materially misstated, i.e., are they reliable or not, or are there significant issues with those assertions. The next is they want to form an opinion about whether or not those financial statements are presented fairly in accordance with the generally accepted accounting principles, those standardized practices across the auditing industry. And they're going to ensure analytical procedures are performed to evaluate financial testing, or financial data. The key impact here is that the substantive type of testing drives the auditor's opinion. So while the controls testing drives how much testing there is, substantive testing drives the auditor's opinion. Now, an example of substantive testing would be document samples, for example, where the auditor is actually looking at the values themselves, the transactions themselves, and based on the accuracy of those, they're helping to form their opinion. An overall theme when it comes to auditing is that the auditor just wants to be confident that Air Force did their processes correctly. When we look disorganized, that reduces the auditor's confidence in providing us a clean opinion. Overall, they're trying to build confidence in the financial statements. They're trying to build confidence in our controls. They're trying to build confidence in all of our processes and our general business practices. Moving on to the next slide for testing documentation. Testing is focused on ensuring that all active restoration sites in ESOMIS, first of all, that they exist. Especially this year, the auditor is really going to focus on site inventory and to make sure that what is on paper, what is in our documentation, what's in ESOMIS matches reality. And the second thing, that they include all expected cleanup costs. Again, they're going to be tracking estimates through every single phase, and they want to see how those transactions mature and change along the process. The auditor may collect the following documents: the site identification and cleanup actions, the cleanup estimates and related facts and assumptions, that would be your PCAD, for example, your project cost estimate assumptions document, and the regulatory concurrence documents for closed sites. One thing that's really important here is site identification. Why would they care about that? If the money is there, why do they care about site identification? It's because they don't just want to look at the total value and look at the number and make sure that the number is right. They want to make sure that the number is categorized correctly, in other words, that the money is the correct color. So we need to make sure that when we're identifying our sites that we're properly categorizing them in the category that they need to be. For example, IRP versus MMRP. For PM and RPM, your specific responsibilities when it comes to testing. First of all, y'all will assist in the performance of walkthroughs. Again, when you see walkthrough, that's a term that the auditor likes to use. It doesn't necessarily mean a physical in-person walkthrough. It could be a observation over a telecon, for example. What the auditor is going to do during a walkthrough is they're going to follow a transaction from cradle to grave. They're going to follow that transaction through all of our IT systems. So it's not just what's on paper. They're going to be tracking it through ESOMIS, any other kind of IT systems we use, until it is reflected on the financial records. That's what they're looking at as the final thing that they want to verify. And they're going to use the exact same documents and IT systems that we use as well. During these walkthrough procedures, they usually include inquiry and observation, where they're asking us questions. Again, if the auditor asks you a question, please do not respond to the auditor directly. We want those responses to go through FIAR. It helps make sure that we facilitate who those questions are going to, who those answers are going to, make sure they get to the right people, and that we have an opportunity to do a QA/QC on that response. There's also going to be inspection of relevant documentation and re-performance of controls. Moving on to the next slide. A big thing that PM, RPMs are going to do, as well as the PRD team especially, is provide documentation for sample selection. Now, the AFCAC CZR managers will manage KSD requests. These are key supporting documents through our share drive. And if you have any other questions on the document flow, please refer back to the diagrams we had in 101. And now moving on to Module 6 with Mrs. Reyes to talk about opinions and findings.
Okay, I think this is the last meaty module, right, for this training, and then we go into quiz and wrap up? Okay, so we're almost done. Module 6, Audit Opinions and Findings. So, Audit Opinions, slide 46. So what is an audit opinion? It's the formal statement made by the auditor concerning the reliability of our financial statements. So the auditor's opinion is based on the control testing, the substantive testing, as well as the application of other GAO procedures, and all that Adam just went over. So control testing, is the testing of processes. Are the processes documented? Are we following those processes? And as Adam provided as an example, making sure that those signatures are present when they're required. And substantive testing is a comparison of the cost to complete to what's in ESO. That's an example of a type of substantive test. The types of audit opinions. So the outcome of an audit is actually considered to be the auditor's opinion. And there's 4 types of opinions. The first one, and the one that we are striving for this year, is the unmodified clean opinion. That means we don't have any NFRs, we don't have any key issues that were identified, and the financial statements are free of material misstatements. The other 3 types of audit opinions are known as the modified audit opinions. They are the qualified opinion. So when the financial records have not been maintained in accordance with GAAP, but there's no misstatements in the financial statement, then that's what you consider to be a qualified opinion. And it's generally a positive opinion and similar to the unmodified clean opinion. But the only difference is that the reason as to why the audit report is not clean is indicated. The adverse opinion, this is the worst type of opinion to the auditor. It indicates that the agency's financial records don't conform to GAAP, and largely the opinion is there may be some fraudulent activity taking place there, even though it could be due to human error, but basically the financial records are grossly misrepresented. Definitely don't ever want to have that opinion. What we had for fiscal year 19 was a disclaimer of opinion. That basically means that the auditor wasn't able to make an audit determination. They didn't have enough documentation to come to a conclusion. There was an absence of appropriate financial records or insufficient controls. So as far as I believe the conclusion was, they really just didn't get through all of our processes, right, Max? For our disclaimer of opinion, the reason for it?
Yeah, they didn't get through all the processes, but, as far as samples and PVC requests went, Restoration did a very good job of answering all of those.
Right, we did submit everything, but they are coming back this year and going back to some of those files that were submitted in fiscal year 19 so they can kind of finish a review of those. Because as I said, they got so much information, and especially for us, it was within the last two months of end of year, so they were really bombarded, and I really don't think that they had enough time to go through everything that they received.
Yeah, and Patty, to your point, they were very complimentary of the walkthroughs that Restoration gave them on the processes, things like the PRD guide. That was a highlight from the audit last year. So
right.
I think a lot of the, I don't want to say issues, but a lot of the back and forth and a lot of the follow-up was just due to EY's ignorance on the complexity of what Restoration does and everything that goes into it.
Yeah, as we mentioned earlier, they aren't familiar with our processes. Environmental isn't their job jar, they're accountants, and so everything was new to them, as, you know, we're learning now about the audit process. So it's just a matter of growing pains on their end and our end as well. So audit findings, slide 48. An audit finding is when the auditor identifies an issue that could be related to the financial statements, the internal controls, or compliance with laws and regulations. And there's 2 types of findings: the material findings, which is a serious issue with those controls or the financial statement, or a non-material finding, which is less serious. So let's take a look at the 2 types of audit findings, slide 49. So there's a new notice of finding and recommendation, and there's a reissued notice of finding and recommendation. So if you have a new NFR, which is what we received for fiscal year 19, you concur or non-concur. We concurred with comments, but that was a whole other issue. Basically, they said the comment that we provided wasn't really valid and it's still a finding. So we said, okay, and continued on with our CAP work. Next step would be the development of the root cause, which is, there's the time frame for each phase. It's supposed to occur within a 3-week period. So what we did was we got together, formed our CAP working group, went through the 5 whys to try and determine our root cause, and we'll talk a little more in depth about that in the next slides. But after the root cause is developed, then we develop the CAP, and then the CAP is uploaded into the NFR database. For the reissuance of an NFR, it's pretty much the same, except that you have 2 options. You can either leave the existing CAP and use the existing CAP and then link the CAP to the reissued NFR, or you can redevelop a CAP, retire the old CAP, and upload the new CAP into the NFR database. So fiscal year audit findings, slide 50. So what the auditor determined was that we did not have a retrospective review process comparing our racer estimates to the actual contract costs. So as a result, they're saying that the financial statement could possibly be misstated. So the audit recommended that we evaluate and analyze our contract cost information and develop and implement a retrospective review process, comparing the estimate to the actual. So, evaluating the CAP process, which is slide 51. The first phase in the corrective action plan is to confirm the receipt of the NFR, and then we want to determine the OPR, which is the Office of Primary Responsibility, the OCR, the stakeholders, and the priority level in that first phase. And then we want to start planning. We need to determine what was the root cause for the deficiency. Why are we receiving the NFR in the first place? Phase 3 is the design of the CAP milestones, the tasks that are going to be involved to address the issue, and determine the estimated completion dates. Phase 4 is the implementation of the CAP. We want to execute the tasks by the designated milestones or estimated completion dates. And then lastly, phase 5 is the validation to confirm that the deficiency has been addressed. So let's actually take a look at what happened in fiscal year 19. So this is the actual root cause analysis that we provided with our CAP. It's one thing to go over the concept of root causes and the CAPs, and it's another thing for you all to actually see what occurred with fiscal year 19. So hopefully this will be helpful in understanding how the process works. But as I said, the finding was due to a lack of a retrospective review. So we did the root cause analysis. We went through the 5 whys. So basically, we don't have a retrospective review process. Why don't we have a retrospective review process? Is it because we didn't have enough people? Is it because we didn't have enough money? Is it because we didn't do the proper planning? What's the reason? So what we concluded was the reason that we don't have a retrospective review process is because we did not have the resources needed to develop and implement the retrospective review process and compare the racer estimates to the actual contract cost. So, what does that corrective action plan look like to address that root cause? Slide 53. So this is the actual planning portion and the 5 tasks associated with that phase. This is the design portion and its 5 tasks associated with that, and the implementation and the 4 tasks associated with that. This top portion, all of the planning pretty much is already completed. We determined the OPR, the OCR, all of that has been closed out. The design, some of that has already been closed out. I believe it still does require staff approval. So staff has it currently, but they haven't approved it. They basically said that we went above and beyond with our CAP, and we're very thorough all the way down to the getting the CAP validated and then going back for loop feedback to make sure that we improve our processes. And they're wanting to see a shorter turnaround time because I believe ours was all the way up to what was it, 2030? I think 2030. So what they asked is if we could just simplify a corrective action plan and do the design portion and the implementation portion early. And that just means they want us to start the implementation, and they want us to close out that cap by the end of this fiscal year. So there was no way that we were going to be able to go through and close everything out and do a very thorough process within a year. And if you think about it, technically, fiscal year already started last October, so we're already running out of time. So we're going to be meeting with staff this Friday, I believe. They're going to provide some feedback because they haven't actually approved our cap just yet. And they're going to let us know how they want us to go about shortening it, what time frame. But from what I understand, like I said, they're going to request that we close everything out by end of year. But just to give you an example of what the implementation steps look like, we're going to develop the retrospective review process, determine the resources that we need, develop guidance on that process, and then provide training. And of course, behind each one of these milestone descriptions, there's a whole series of small steps that has to take place under each category. So there's a lot involved in this corrective action plan, and we'll be working with the working group to make sure that we get all that accomplished. Anybody have any questions? Maybe one day one of you will be working on the working group for the corrective action plan. Well, ideally, we don't want any NFRs. Okay, are there any questions on the line?
Patty, we do have a few.
Okay.
Just for one, going back a little bit to the process of written documentation and written answers to questions to the auditor. So one of the people on the phone said when they provide written answers to questions and they go through you to be QA/QC'd, will you, the fire team, follow up with them to make sure that something wasn't changed that would make it technically incorrect?
Oh, of course. We would keep them involved in all of the correspondence and provide constant feedback. Yeah, we don't want to do anything or especially change anything without their approval and knowledge.
Wonderful. And then the second question was if a PM or RPM is on a call or in a meeting with an auditor, and the auditor asks a question, should the PM or RPM ask them to submit the question in writing so that it can be documented with a response submitted through the official process, or how should they respond in that moment?
With the interviews, you tend to have to provide the verbal response. If it's something that's extremely complicated and process-driven, then you might want to request if you can provide something in writing along with the required documentation. Again, not offering up more information than what's requested, but generally you do have to provide a verbal response, which is why we want to make sure you have all those do's and don'ts. We want to make sure, you know, we kind of prep you for site visits and interaction with the auditor.
Will there be a FIR team member present for all interviews?
I don't know if they're going to include us in those, Max.
Yeah, we have to talk about that.
Okay.
So you won't get an auditor coming to you as a surprise
Right.
question.
It'll all be scheduled.
There will be scheduled questions.
And we will make sure you're prepped ahead of time. We'll work with you, ask you if you have any questions, if there's any areas that you think might be a concern, make sure we tie up all of those loose ends, stuff like that. Make sure you're familiar with your auditor language. We'll refer you to all the documents that we have on the SharePoint site because we want to make sure that you're successful with your interaction with the auditor. Exactly. Yes. Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Adam for the review and wrap-up.
All right, everybody, made it to the last module, so thank y'all for sticking around. We really appreciate it, and hopefully this wouldn't take too long so we can give back everybody some time. For final takeaways, there's some important things to review here. One, have you reviewed all your personal roles and responsibilities? Here's why this is really important. We only have 5 days to provide a data request back to the auditor, so we don't want people taking too much time not understanding what their role is. If you know these things ahead of time, then you can respond to our data requests a lot sooner. Plus, we can make sure that all the processes are done correctly. Second thing, do you know the names of the correct POCs? Reason we ask this is because sometimes PRD might not always have access to certain information, or other groups, other stakeholders that we are sending data requests to. They might not understand fully, or they might not have access fully to that document that we were asking for, so they might have to send that request on to somebody else. So when you have those POCs available for you now, we can respond to those data requests sooner. Next thing, do you understand the overall goal of what DoD is trying to get? At the end of the day, we're trying to get a clean audit. So we want everyone to understand a clean audit, that's what our goal is. Next thing, are you familiar with how to submit all final documentation? Again, we only have 5 days to provide data requests. We want to make sure everybody understands how to do that. And have you gotten the information for any questions or concerns you have prior to or during the audit? Answer any questions from the auditor if they're unclear. Again, they're not environmental folks, so they might be using terms or verbiage that that we don't understand, and vice versa. So we want to make sure that we get anything clarified ahead of time. And if you have any questions for FIR or on the process, please reach out to Patty or myself so we can have these answers to you prior to an audit. On to review questions for question number 1. For each internal control, what does ASCAC need to identify for an auditor? Remember, that was that controls example that we did. It's going to be all 3 of these: the control owner, the supporting proof of the control that the control was actually conducted, and the timing and frequency of that control. And then the second thing, the purpose of a risk assessment. That is to identify the risk levels and prioritize the risk areas. Again, we're all limited by time and money, so we unfortunately can't fix every single problem or prevent 100% of errors from occurring, but we want to focus on the high-risk controls first. Question number 3, which of the following is a potential result of failing the control testing? This is going to be A and B. One, that there's going to be increased risk for material misstatements, and that there's going to be increased workload for the RPM or the PM by having to spend more time engaging with the auditor and preparing documentation. Now, what's important here isn't just what the answer is, it's also what the answer isn't. You'll notice that the answer is not C. It doesn't mean that we will automatically fail our audit. So if we do have a failure in a control, it could mean that it's one of those more so insignificant controls that isn't going to have an adverse effect on the financial statement, and we could still get a clean audit. Overall, our financial statements don't have to be perfect. Now, while we want them to be perfect and we strive for them to be perfect, if there's an insignificant error on a financial statement, we can still get a clean audit. So don't think that it's automatic failure, and please don't think you have to lie or mislead the auditor if you see a mistake on something. Last but not least, again, if you have any questions, please contact Patty or myself, and we can get that over to you. For anybody on the phone, please send an email to Mr. Colton Richardson and CC myself so we can make sure that you get your training certificate. If you attended 101 this morning, just let us know that you attended 101 and 201 so we can get you both of your certificates. Those should be out in about a week or so. The other thing is we will be sending a link out to everybody with the video recorded presentation as well as the updated presentation, the PM, RPM cheat sheets, and some other information. If you're a PM or RPM, we highly recommend you print out that cheat sheet and keep it on hand in case you do have to have a walkthrough with an auditor. But we really sincerely appreciate everybody's time. We'll go ahead and give back half an hour to everybody, but we can take right now to take some questions.
If you could just go back and stress the FIR workflow.
Oh, yes, ma'am. If y'all have any questions for FIR, please also send it to the FIR workflow just to make sure that all the folks in the FIR team can get that email and we can respond to it as soon as possible in case someone is out of the office. If anyone has any questions, we can take time to answer questions now. Otherwise, we can give half an hour back to everybody. Yes, sir.
I'm the PM for Dover, so I just read the email on my break. On one of the things they asked for, they looked at the shard in the PRD process, and they were asking for some of the documents that are referenced in there. A lot of those are AR number, whatever, you know, things on the admin record. Do they have access to the admin record, or, well, it's public, thing, or do we need to go and actually get those documents and give them?
There should be somebody who has access to those documents. They should be able to provide them to you.
Can our response be, these are on the admin record? Go
I
find them?
believe, if it was me responding on the opposite side, I would go get whatever they
Exactly.
include it with your response. Are we able to just refer them to the admin record?
So, that's a great question. A lot of what we're gonna do this year is going to be pointing them to, the AR, because like Adam and Patty talked about, I think with Patty, one of the assertions is called completeness. So showing that we have, basically identified our universe of sites, or our baseline of sites, and then updated that over time. And evidence of that is on the ARIR. So we need to have a conversation with Ernst & Young around what is acceptable documentation or evidence to them. But to answer your question, the AR should suffice, and what's on there should suffice.
Sure.
We don't wanna, you know, we can't provide documents obviously, but we don't wanna make more work for people than they have to.
We can talk about this offline, but are they checking to make sure that he's familiar with the admin record, where he can pull that information? Because that's what it sounds like to me.
Well, we can huddle after the
Yeah.
meeting here, and we can
Okay.
include that in FAQs for everybody's awareness.
Right.
Okay.
Question in the room is if you get a document request for information that's on the admin record, can you just provide reference to the admin record to be sufficient? So far, it appears that the answer is yes. We will have a further conversation with the auditor to make sure that that is sufficient. But if you do get a request for anything that is on the admin record, you can provide in your response that it is included in the admin record rather than providing the actual document itself. Yes, sir.
Another question, do we get with you two on updating POCs? Because one of the persons on that email is not, she retired.
Yeah, I noticed there were 2 or 3 that actually kicked back. We had one retired, and then people were out of the office, and we've got acting. So I was actually gonna get with Marco to make sure I have all the correct POCs and they're up to date.
I sent a note also to see who took her place.
Okay, great. Yeah, we
Gotcha.
appreciate that.
If anyone on the phone has a question about FIRE POCs or other POCs, you can always, forward that question over to Patty and myself or the FIRE workflow, and we might be able to answer that question for you.
There are a lot of changes taking place with people retiring at the RPM, PM levels, really throughout the organization. So we just need to make sure that our admins have all the proper POCs as people shift out and shift in, so that during the audit season, we know who to reach out to.
Colton, do we have any other questions in the chat?
Not at this time.
Awesome. Do we have any other questions on the phone or in the room? All right, awesome. Well, we sincerely appreciate everybody's attendance. Thank you all very much.